Good evening. This is week 4 of sustainability issues in public administration, and I'm Professor Henderson, as most of you know. And tonight I'm going to be talking with you, or to you, I guess, about the legal contexts of sustainability. The second component of tonight's course, week 4, is ethical contexts of sustainability, and that material has been uploaded into files and Canvas on the course site, and there's some reading and some writing assignments associated with it. So with that said, we can get started here. And I'm new at this, so if I look kind of goofy, that's because I'm new at this. So as I said, tonight we're going to talk about environmental law, and this is broken into a couple of parts. The first one is pretty much what those environmental laws are, so the legislative history of environmental law in the United States. We really begin, as Professor Lecrone's presentation indicates, in the 1960s. Rachel Carson's publication of Silent Spring is sort of the marker that we use from when the environmental movement began. The president who was, as he was in so many areas, most active in environmental legislation was President Johnson. And you can see this quotation from him there. One of the things that that quotation does indicate is we can't create the environment, we can only preserve it. And that kind of does speak for the entire environmental movement. It is a matter of preservation. The idea of sustainability, of course, is can we preserve the environment at the rate that we are using it and changing it? In other words, are those practices sustainable? So I'm first going to talk about President Johnson's environmental law legacy, and I want to say something very basic about it. And that is, as with so many things outside of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, Johnson's the environmental legislation that Johnson and the Congress approved in the 1960s was largely incentive-based. It was not, as we'll discuss later, command and control. In other words, in order to get state and local governments and businesses and individuals to comply with some of these pieces of legislation and the regulations and standards that they set, the government used financial incentives. And this was something that was quite prominent in the 1960s. You probably have learned about this in other contexts. Community development block grants and categorical grants and all these other mechanisms that the federal government used to, again, give incentives to state and local governments in particular to undertake programs and projects which would have the backing of the federal government. These were usually partnerships, of course, but it's pretty much the same process. Again, the process where the federal government, using its vast supply of revenue that it derives from across the United States through the income tax, that big pile of money is then redistributed to the state and local governments in the form of these grants, block and categorical. And in the 60s, it was mainly categorical, meaning there were very, very specific grants for very, very specific projects for which state and local governments actually had to apply. As you see on this slide here, some of the legislation was actually approved. The Clean Air Act, the Water Quality Act, both precursors to the actual Clean Air Act that we'll talk about from the 1970s, and the Clean Water Act. Safe Water, that should be Safe Water Conservation Act. I need to fix that slide. But these are pieces of legislation that were actually approved. The other things that you see there are bills. They were proposed, they may have been projects, there may have been categorical grants associated with them, but they weren't necessarily pieces of legislation. So continuing with President Johnson's environmental law legacy, this is sort of the kind of the outdoor part, the nature part, if you will. Johnson and his wife Lady Bird are actually quite sensitive to the the outdoor environment, the national parks. Probably the most notable piece of legislation is the Highway Beautification Act, you see there on that list, where Congress approved funds and programs and standards to upgrade the highways throughout the United States, try to do things with billboards, try to keep the trash picked up, make things look more scenic. And you've been on scenic highways, probably all of you, throughout the United States, and that's where the money for those programs actually originally came. These other programs, Wilderness Act obviously speaks for itself. The Endangered Species Act, you're probably quite familiar with that, and that's where it got its beginning. The National Park Foundation, establishing a financial foundation to support the national parks. Wetlands Preservation Bill, this is another big item that we're going to see more of as we get into the 1970s. And the Historic Preservation Act, it seems a little bit out of context there, what's that got to do with the environment? But historic preservation of buildings, of architecture, of tracts of land, of grounds, of burial grounds, for example, all of that was covered by the National Historic Preservation Act. And much of this legislation, again, was based on incentives, financial incentives coming from the federal government. So we move on now to probably the sort of landmark moment in the history of environmental legislation. If the 1960s were a period of awakening, as Professor LaCrone probably pointed out, the 1970s was a period of action. Yes, the Johnson administration was responsible for a large amount of legislation affecting the environment, but as I said before, those were incentivized pieces of legislation. But before we get to what are known as command and control pieces of legislation, I did want to speak with you a bit about probably the most important bill that was passed at this time, and that's the National Environmental Policy Act of 1969. As you can see from the slide, this law passed a framework for protecting the environment. And the framework was not one in which heavy regulations were set down, but it contained a declaration of a commitment to protecting the environment. And this was actually quite a significant moment in the history of environmental legislation. 1970, you know, is when Earth Day was founded, or 1969, in fact, was when Earth Day was founded. And I just recalled it was when Woodstock happened. Anyway, but this was a very, very big moment in environmental history. The significant thing about the National Environmental Policy Act of 1969, in addition to its stated commitment to environmental policy, is the establishment of the requirement that federal agencies had to undertake an evaluation of sorts of any project that said agency was undertaking that could have an environmental impact. And they were required under NEPA, agencies were required to demonstrate that they had done an environmental analysis to see what the project might or might not do to the environment and to make adjustments if necessary. The main thing that was required, and we'll come back to this later on, the main thing that was required under NEPA was this environmental impact statement. Okay, and as I said, we will come back to that in a little bit. I want to just draw attention to the fact that we are talking about the Nixon administration. Richard Nixon was a Republican, right? You probably know, infamously almost impeached over the Watergate scandal, and also, very controversial economic circumstances and policies, and also very controversial policies in Vietnam. But note that President Nixon was the one who signed this legislation. He was a conservative Republican. But his administration was extremely productive, as we'll see as we go through the history, extremely productive in producing strict environmental regulations. And as you are probably aware, the current administration, the previous two Bush administrations, and the Reagan administrations, not such big fans of that. But there will be more to say about that shortly. Sorry. One One other point that is interesting about NEPA, and that's the abbreviation for National Environmental Policy Act, is that most state and local governments have approved something quite similar. All right, so there are permitting requirements throughout the states. I read an interesting article in the Inquirer the other day that in New Jersey there are all these, I don't know, little vacation shacks located in these wetland areas that were kind of never licensed. They just kind of built them, and some of them are on public lands and some of them are on private lands. And suddenly the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection is planning to take them down because they are having, the NJDEP argues they're having adverse environmental effects, and so they're going to be taken down possibly for lack of a permit. A lot of states have this. Philadelphia, where I live, Chester, where Widener is located, have legislation similar to NEPA. And the other interesting thing, of course, is that there are a lot of nations in the world that also have used NEPA as a model. So 1970, 1969 was not just the beginning of the environmental movement at the national level. It was the beginning of an environmental movement throughout the federal system in the United States and indeed throughout the world.